Welcome to Tracing Your Family Roots. My name is Arlene Sachs, and this is Sally Ann Sachs. We recently did a show on oral history, so today we want to follow that up with talking about written history.
Or written sources of information.
Yeah, anything that is written down, whether it's we'll talk about different things, but vital statistics, birth, marriage, deaths, and then look at some of the other things that you follow that up with. Let's start with the very, very oldest document, one of the oldest documents I have, which is from 1792, which is a marriage certificate. And that is unique, and I know you can't read it, but you can, it's handwritten obviously, but there are a couple of very unique things about that. And this particular one gives the date not only as 1792, but also as the first year of the reign of Napoleon, because Napoleon started his own calendar.
Right.
So that gives you a piece of history that you learn. And that particular document also has signatures, naturally, of the couple that got married and all the witnesses, and that becomes so important.
Can I back you up a little bit? First of all, why do you have this document? Where did you find it? I'm just starting out in genealogy, and I'm talking to you, and you're showing me something from 1792, and I'm lost.
Okay.
Go to the beginning. Okay. What did you do?
Almost everything that I'm going to show you today, except two things, came from the Mormon Church records.
Okay.
Everything was on microfilm.
Okay.
So that is probably the place that I would look for
people who have ancestors in Germany.
In Western Europe, in the United States, Canada, I don't know where.
Right. Increasingly, and Poland, some from Poland. As you go further to the east in Europe, they have fewer, but they've gotten more. But yes, for Germany, it's a wealth of information.
I want to talk about, okay, this couple got married. The following year, they had a child. And I want to look now at that birth certificate, because that birth certificate is very unique, too.
Okay.
It again says it's now the second year of the reign of Napoleon, so it's got that at the very top of it. It lists, of course, the parent's name and the child's name. It lists the witnesses, and at the very bottom, the father signed it and the grandfather signed it. So the
grandfather
signed it, yes. And if we'll find the right slide to put up, we'll take a look at it. At the bottom are the signatures. And I don't have all the signatures, but I do have those two signatures.
Signatures are, we have not talked about signatures much on this show, but let me just, if you will, say a word or two. Recently, I was asked to peer review an article for the National Genealogical Society, a brilliantly researched genealogy. And one of the key sources of information in establishing that this was one and the same man over time was the fact that they found signatures. And signatures don't vary a great deal. So one and the same person, if you can get signatures, you know you've got the same person. We seldom talk about it, but they're really important.
Well, you know, I did translated the books of my great-great-grandfather. In fact, this man whose birth certificate we're looking at. And then somebody in Israel found another book, but that was microfilmed. And all I had to do was take one glance at it. Nope, I know that's him. Yeah. There was no doubt in my mind that it was the same person.
In fact, that's a really important piece of written documentation.
Yeah. So that's why I was so thrilled to see these signatures on the bottom of that.
Yeah, because, as we know, and we're going to go into it in more detail, just because it's written down doesn't mean it's necessarily true. We've all been taught not to believe everything we read. But handwriting, you can't really fake.
Well, I guess there's
but not those great big things you're talking about where it was a diary. You know,
and who's going to fake a signature on a birth certificate?
Right.
I mean,
so when you see handwriting, it's really, really a good clue that it's the same person.
Now, if we can look at the third slide, which is just 9 years later, which is 1801, it's the wife, and you can see it's just a little tiny blurb.
Oh, it's the wife's what?
It's the wife's birth certificate. It's really one line in a church registry, because the evangelical church kept the records over there.
For Jews.
For Jews. And on the right side, it has the date. And then there's something scribbled sort of towards the bottom right-hand corner, and that says, she got married in 1928. So in other words, this town was she was no longer a citizen of this town. She was gone. She had married. And all it says is this child was born to list the parent's name, and that's it. So there you have the two vastly different ones. Right. The first one was from Alsace, the eastern part, what's now the eastern part of France, although the language was German in that because
they kept changing back and forth.
Yeah. And the other one was from Germany, I don't know, 100 miles away or something, relative, close. But so what you can find in birth certificates, and that's what we need to point out, you need to look for them. You might find nothing except their child and the name, or you might find a whole lot. And It just depends on who was writing it or what the town was.
And to back up, something I wanted to say at the very beginning. Even when you think you know the birth date, the birthplace, marriage dates, marriage places, get records. Get all the records you can on any given individual, because sometimes you're going to be surprised.
Yes.
And even when you think there are no records, ask for them. Before I forget it, I want to give this one example. The United States did not require passports until the 1920s, but some people took out passports even when they didn't need them for whatever reason, business travelers or because they thought it was useful. There's a professional genealogist in Boston, Nancy Arbeiter, was trying to find the place of birth of some German Jew who had come to the United States in the 1900s when our records didn't ask, where were you from? Didn't know where that person was from. Because she has a list of what documents you always get, she wrote away to the State Department to ask for passports. And she got one from 1880, or thereabouts, and there was the birthplace.
See, you could keep on coming up with new sources. I mean, we've been doing genealogy forever, and to me, that was a new one.
I recommend that you make a list of possible documents, and one of them is, just like wills are possible documents, passports, even when you think they don't exist, even if you think you know it all, because sometimes you find stuff that you didn't think to think about.
Yeah.
So, okay.
Okay, so we've looked at a marriage, we've looked at a birth. Let's look at a couple of death records. Okay. These are both from Chicago, so it's the same, more or less the same form. And that's the first one, and if we can focus in on the next slide, which focuses in on the left side so we can read it a little bit. This one tells a whole lot. It's from Laser Seelig, and it's dated 1920, and he was from Fashionbach, which is where he was from, and his wife was from. Do you realize what this tells us? What the town was.
Right, exactly.
Somebody knew.
Right, and you seldom get that. I have seldom seen that on a death certificate. I get Germany usually, or Russia, or something like that. That's
the next example is the other side of Sid's family, 1929. Everything is wrong.
Well,
oh, nope, not that one. One before. One with Ray.
The thing is,
her age was wrong because the doctors didn't know the age. She lied. She always lied about her age. The doctor didn't know. He must have asked, how long have you been in this country? How long have you been here? She answered, how long have you been in Chicago? Not how long had she been in the country. So everything was wrong.
Well, but also, the person who gives the death certificate information is a distraught, usually, relative. I want to go back to the marriage thing for just a minute because it's so funny to me. We've all found errors on all of these things. It's sort of, among genealogists, we say the best records are the marriage records because the people who give the information are the people whom it's about. Well, it ain't necessarily always true. I got the marriage application of my grandparents, immigrants, from the synagogue in Toronto where they were married. And my grandmother's maiden name is wrong. My great-grandmother was married twice. Her first husband's name was Weiss. Then she married a guy named Slumovitz. My grandmother was the Slumovitz. It says her maiden name was Weiss.
Well, it probably just, took the name she was and used that as the maiden name.
No, I think maybe somebody else filled it out and they knew her brothers and sisters. They were her half-brothers and sisters. And so they assumed she was Weiss.
Yeah.
It's a good thing I knew better.
I want to... If you can focus in on this. This is a record from Germany. What I want to point out is that all of the ones that I found, like Bernard Kahn's Marriage, and they had the names out in the margin. And this was such a...
So you could just scan.
So we could go from page to page, and all you had to do was look at that one name. You don't have to be able to read the language, but right here you can get somebody to write out, somebody who knows the language, write out the name, and you compare it.
This is so funny because this name looks like nothing to me. It looks like Chinese to me. And you looked at it and said, didn't I see that it's Sophia Selig? No, because I didn't know that that funny-looking thing is an S.
Well, somebody once asked on Jewish, and they said, somebody said my grandmother's name is Ophelia. That doesn't match anything. I laughed because I knew immediately that had to be that.
Because you know how to write Old German.
Because the letter O is the German Old S, and the H, of course, comes all the way down.
Of course.
So it looks like our...
Back to handwriting again. I think what that also tells you is that you become familiar with things that you work on.
I certainly didn't know this before. And you don't have to, whether it's German or Russian or whatever language you're looking at, if you can find somebody that knows the language, write out the names you're looking for, and then you can see if it looks sort of similar, copy it, and then you can have somebody translate it. You don't need to know the whole language.
Sure.
And if you do this often enough, you'll be able to get familiar enough, at least to be able to read that.
Right.
So that's...
So, okay, so you've got these nice marriage and death and birth records from the Mormons, most of them.
Yes,
but
not that one line that came from...
Right, and then as you say, don't believe them all blindly. There's lots of reasons for errors. Some were inadvertent, some were deliberate.
Yeah. Now, we had one more death, and that was the obituary that I wanted to briefly mention. That was from a newspaper called the Aufbau.
Right.
And the Aufbau was a German newspaper, started...
German-Jewish, no?
German-Jewish newspaper, started post-Holocaust, and very often had articles looking for someone. This is a Martha Wolf, who was my great-aunt. Sally is her husband. Sally is a perfectly valid male name.
It wasn't short for Solomon? A nickname for Solomon?
That's the only name I ever heard. Maybe it was some distant past.
It was.
That was the name that he was known under.
You've just solved a puzzle for me. Can I just tell you? When the first time I went to Israel, I wrote in advance to all these archivists, all of whom happened to be German in Israel at the time. And when I showed up, they all said, but you're a woman. They thought Sally was a man's name.
Okay, that's why, because it's a perfectly valid German name.
Right.
And the other names on that were their children, and then the bottom name on that, was my grandmother. It doesn't identify her as my grandmother, Rosa Ostheimer, G.E.B., born of Allerstein, and it says she lives in Chicago. And actually, it even had our address on there, I see. So, you know, it told anybody that would have known of the family, hey, you know, they would have known where to fit it in. Okay, so that takes care of the vital records. I think the next thing, probably the easiest thing for people to look for, is census records.
And the most important. I mean, in fact, some genealogists actually start with census records. I don't know why. Most Jewish genealogists don't, but all the NGS people seem to start with census records.
Well,
they locate a person in a time and place.
And remember how hard it was for us to go down to the archives and sit and look through pages of documents if you didn't know the exact address and the district and the enumeration.
That's right. First you had to go to city directories to get an address, so then you knew what census.
Unless you were, there were a few that were indexed, but not all of them. But now it is so simple to go, at least in Fairfax County, and I imagine most places, that there's some library that has access to Ancestry.com.
Sure.
And Ancestry.com is very expensive if you do it yourself, although I think they have occasional times for a month you can have access and you know, try to do it. But here in Fairfax County, you can all the libraries have at least one or two computers that have it. And I do want to say not all computers are going to have it, so if you go there, ask the librarian which one has access. And from there, you type in the year you want and the area you want and the name, and everything is indexed and it pops up for you, and then you see the full sheet.
Right.
So it is so much easier. I've been able to go sideways, whereas
What do you mean by sideways?
Well, it's like a third cousin, and I was able to find her ancestors in Enid, Oklahoma. I wouldn't have looked for them, but I found all of that stuff because I could sit at the computer and it took me 5 minutes, not 5 hours.
The other important thing about census, especially 1900 and 1910, look to see who is living at that address, because so many immigrants came and lived with their uncle for a while or something, or cousins came, or somebody. If you find, they're listed usually often as boarders, and if you see a different last name, it might be the mother's brother, and then you know the mother's maiden name. Yeah. So write down all the names, and also,
well, best copy it, especially if you're on Ancestry. You click it and you get an electronic copy. Then you can print it out. But you still
have to have it in a place. Keep it yourself in your unknown directory. You know, the place where you keep the names that you don't know yet.
Well, if you keep the one, okay, Sally Jones is your aunt, so you keep that under her name. If you want to sometime go back, you've always got it under her name.
Well, yeah, but I do it differently. I keep a list of names of people who are people of interest, but I don't know who they are. And I sometimes flip through that. That's easy for me to do. So I do that kind of thing. The other thing to remember is to look at other people in the same apartment building. Because, especially in New York City, you know, you had the Hungarian Street, you had the Romanian Street, you laughed, this is true. You had the Litvak Street, they didn't mix. They didn't mix. The Litvaks and the Galicianers didn't mix. So you had neighborhoods that were all Hungarian, that kind of thing.
And you can look through the whole neighborhood then and see if there's any family. You know, if they weren't in the same house, they might be next door.
Yes, people tended to cluster together.
Because, you know, you want to be able to talk to somebody and their friends.
Also, people from the same little shtetl live nearby. So census records are key.
And again, the best type of records, but we've talked about, is something filled out by the person. But again, even there you find things that are wrong.
I just have to mention this. You know how we do birth records. Also, we tend to really believe birth records, right? Wrong. I got an article yesterday from this rabbi in Israel who does professional work, Shalom Brownstein, and it was all about errors in birth dates, and they are funny. He tells that once upon a time, Pennsylvania's motor vehicles decided to send out a questionnaire. And he saw his grandfather's birth was listed as 1882, but he knew it was 1883, so he asked his grandfather, and here's the story. When they sent out the questionnaire, Grandpa's insurance agent called him up, and he said, look, the motor vehicles doesn't have birth dates. Knock a few years off of your birth date, you'll get a lower rate on your insurance. Grandpa was a very
He knocked a year off. That's what it was. He knocked a year off.
So Grandpa was very ethical, and he decided, well, he could bring himself to knock 1 year off. Well, he didn't know how to do math. What he did was make himself 1 year older.
Yeah, he knocked a year off the date that he was born. Instead
of 83, it became 82. Or, you know, there's just loads of reasons why, we did it. Do you remember when you turned 12, you had to pay full fare on the bus? And if you could get away with it, you pretended you were still 11.
Oh, yeah.
Or at the movies?
Oh, at the movies for years, till I was 14, 15.
And so, well, some people came over on boats, and they made, if they were children and not and they weren't adults, on airplanes still.
Or younger children came over by themselves and pretended
they were older for fear they wouldn't get in.
Okay, let's look at some other records too, because we don't have too much time left. Draft records and any kind of military records are important, and you can get a hold of those through
Ancestry has them, or any. World War I are the most interesting, because, again, that often gives you the name of the place in the old country, which is so hard to find. Naturalization records are key. They give you the information for the ship arrivals. And so, of course, ship arrival manifests tell you, hopefully, if the later ones, where they came from.
Yeah, sometimes.
And where they're going.
Yeah, sometimes it's just the country, though. The ones I found are just the country.
Well, you're looking earlier ones.
Well, even my mother,
the thing about Ellis Island, we do have to say this.
Yeah.
Ellis Island on the web is so full of errors, it's just breathtaking. So if you want to do Ellis Island, do two things. One is to go to SteveMorse.org. And the other thing is to always look at the manifest. Don't look at the computer record of it, because this one man I was telling you about, whose name was Hillel, was listed on the computer as Gittel and as a woman. And
well, so it's just like this would be Ophelia. It would, you know, if they were reading this, it would be Ophelia. And after all, the records there were really filled out by the captains, weren't they? Isn't that?
No, mostly they were filled out in the ship sailing offices by clerks in Hamburg.
So if that was a German, they would have been writing in this manner.
That's exactly right, and that's exactly why the spelling is German spelling very often. Because if the immigrant is carrying false papers or doesn't have any papers at all, he says his name. The clerk writes what he hears. And the thing to tell people, though, you say they won't believe us, is they weren't. The names were not changed at Ellis Island. It was against U.S. law. And in fact, the way people came in, if they were steerage, they lined up in this hall and they got called up one at a time to be interviewed by the immigration official who had the manifest and checked their name off.
So it could have been the next stop they went to after.
The minute they got on shore, they might have
somebody else stopped and asked their name, and they thought.
Some relative said the famous.
Well, either that. I mean, it could have been somebody sitting at the next desk that said, you know, who knows? I mean, we don't know.
But we have many. In fact, one of the big things you want to look for is what was the original name. That can stop a lot of genealogists, and in fact, some of the naturalization papers have a place on the back for also known as, because when people finally got their naturalization, they had to say what ship they came on. Our government officials checked to make sure they were on that ship to see if they'd been here 5 years. If they'd changed their names, they had to tell what the name was they had sailed under.
Yeah, because they had a
which may or may not have been their real name. My grandfather sailed under a false name.
Yeah, that's a whole other story again.
That's don't believe everything you read.
I do want to mention the religious institutions, because particularly in Europe, before they had civil records, the churches were responsible for the records. So if you knew your parents were Catholic, you'd go to the local Catholic church, or evangelical. Those were the two main churches in Germany. And one or the other, whatever that little town was, would have had the Jewish records as well. Right. That priest was simply responsible, so they had to go over and register the name.
Right.
And that's where that one that I showed came from. It was in, and I actually went to the church. She says, well, I don't have any more than I told you before. She says, see, here was what it is. Because they wrote me that information. I had to see it for myself. Sure. I wanted to see what was there.
Absolutely. And also the thing about names, no Jew came into the United States with the name of Harry. Harry was a name he took after he got here. So you have to know what their old country names were, too. Yeah. So don't be put off, as I did one day. I went down to the National Archives looking for Harry Solomon, and I found 3 English farmers. Then I realized what I was doing.
What was it?
Zvi.
Zvi.
Sure.
Okay.
Hirsch.
Okay, Hirsch I would have known.
No, his name was Zvi Hirsch, and he was Hirsch, and then Hirsch became Harry. Aaron became Harry. Chaim became Harry. Could have been any of those.
Harry or Henry, too.
Oh, they weren't Henry in the old country. Oh, you mean Henry here?
Yeah, Henry here, like a Heinrich would have been.
Right, but they often became Harry was a big one. Like Isaac became Isidore. There was names that were popular. And before we stop, if we have a minute, I must say something about newspapers. Yeah. I have gotten so many articles this past month about people who found unbelievable, they fixed their brick walls by going to the microfilm copies of Jewish newspapers, which is where your husband's going to go look in Columbia, Missouri, for the Jewish newspapers from St. Louis.
Is any of that online, or we have to go there?
I'm afraid you have to go there.
Our next vacation.
Next vacation. There's still some stuff that's not online. Hello, if you're going to be a real genealogist, you may have to go and dig in the courthouse once in a while. And it's in those local records and in the ethnic records.
Now, how did it get to
State Historical Archives.
But it was from Missouri.
And Columbia, Missouri.
Columbia, Missouri. Okay.
Yeah, as you say, there are names that appear in every state. So newspapers, anything written, but newspapers, and we didn't mention cemeteries. And of course, they're not written, but those tombstones can have a lot of good information too.
And some cemeteries that still exist in Europe still have the records. Like I know the big one in Frankfurt, you go there and, well, the old man that used to take care of it has died, so I don't know exactly how they have it now. But all of those records exist. You find the person's name and they'll tell you the row and those still stand.
In our local congregation here in Washington has opened a new cemetery, and when we bought plots, we were asked to fill out a genealogical questionnaire, which
that's good. They're getting in
right, and I was really very pleased about that. But of course, with Jewish tombstones, you're going to have the name of the father because if the name is written,
Ben or Bob.
Yeah, because the name is written in the Hebrew manner instead of
Well, sometimes
so and so son up with the older ones.
Yeah.
Maybe not the current ones, but
well, even some of the older German ones were actually in German.
Really,
yes.
There was no Hebrew on them.
There might have been some Hebrew on them, but generally they were 70
Hebrew,
to 80% English.
If there was Hebrew, most commonly
well,
the name would have
even
been,
if it was in English, it said
so and so son of. So that still remained. Isn't that interesting?
Well, Bernard Kahn's daughter listed, him, not all of that, but it was in English.
And of course, even then you have mistakes.
Oh yes, her name was spelled wrong.
Exactly.
And I mean, I know how he spelled it because I have hundreds of pages where he wrote her name.
Spelling is a whole different story.
We don't pay attention to spelling.
Only the sound, so meaning the consonants.
Yeah.
And spelling didn't standardize until late in the 19th century in Europe. So, and people, this last name business was a government thing. People weren't so...
Especially Jews didn't care about the last name.
And they didn't want to be counted.
Yeah, well, that's a whole other story.
Wills. We almost forgot wills.
Oh, yes, there should be a will that he has also.
There's the will.
There's the will. You cannot... that's a will from St. Louis, and you can't see it, but it's Sid's great-grandfather's will about his grandfather who changed the name to S-A-C-H-S, and it's underlined, S-A-C-K-S, and it's underlined. The interesting thing, though, is it's marked with an X that he couldn't read.
And
couldn't write.
Right. The other thing is it's a great source of female married names, where they're leaving stuff to the married daughters.
Yeah. Well, this particular one doesn't, but it mentions his wife and it mentions the bedding and stuff like that.
But I have found that's one of the best sources for the married names of daughters.
Yeah. Yes, of course, if you're leaving something. But somehow I was very, very surprised to find a will.
I know. Most of us are, but they exist more often than you think.
Because that implied having to spend money to pay somebody to write it out and all of that. So anyway, I hope that some people get some idea of the documents they need to look for, the papers they need to look for.